Hello. Today we're going to talk about The Great Gatsby, Chapter 6, in which I'm going to focus on misogynistic narrators, the frontier, social niceties, and time turners. Don't worry, the boots behind me will get explained. The first thing we have to do is distinguish the narrator from the novelist. This is just a reminder, you know this. Francis Scott Fitzgerald is not Nick Carraway. The author is not the narrator. Even though you might hear the first person pronoun, I, don't get them mixed up. Fitzgerald is writing Carraway, whose perspective we see. All right, so what I'm about to talk about, I don't want you thinking that I'm saying any of this about F. Scott Fitzgerald. I'm saying it about what's inside of the novel, about Nick, the narrator. And he draws attention to himself as narrator, right? You'll remember those moments when he says, as I look back on my pages, or when I was writing this, different things such as that. In this, remember our discussion of the difference between the poet and the speaker, right? This is why we worked hard to talk about the speaker rather than conflate, say, Emily Dickinson with the voice of the I. The first part, an unconsciously misogynistic narrator or a misogynistic narrator, right? So I've used this wordplay with parentheses. It's not very interesting wordplay. It is something you'll find quite often as you continue your literary studies, and you can decide if you find it annoying or useful. In what follows, I want to use this word accretion, and accretion means a buildup. And what happens is you accrete different examples as evidence, and it creates a pattern which creates a texture. And what I want to argue is that we are going to have a texture of misogyny here. So the very first person that we see in this chapter is, quote, an ambitious young reporter. Then we go into the flashback, in which we also learn that Gatsby is ambitious, but that's beside the point for now. And instead, Nick describes Gatsby's brown, hardening body. About this young Gatsby, we learn he knew women early, and since they spoiled him, he became contemptuous of them, of young virgins because they were ignorant, of the others because they were hysterical. Already, we have this sort of connection between the way Nick views people and the way that Gatsby views people. For instance, we learn that he's contemptuous of these women. Later on at the party, we're going to see something similar. And keep in mind, Nick had said, hey, I reserve judgment. But what we found is Nick does not reserve judgment. And we have this nice comparison, young virgins versus the others. I'll leave you to consider what you think the others is. However, they're described differently. One group is ignorant. Ignorant of what? One possibility is they're ignorant of sex because they're young virgins, and the other is of worldly matters. And the charge against the other women for hysteria is rooted in an entire discourse of misogyny and calling women hysterical. This is something that you'll encounter as you go on, and I hope other teachers will also talk about this charge of hysteria. If you're interested in it, a simple Google search on women, misogyny, and hysteria will pull up a lot of examples for you. We continue learning about this younger version of Gatsby, James Gatz. It was from Cody that he inherited money, a legacy of $25,000. He didn't get it. He never understood the legal device that was used against him, but what remained of the millions went intact to Ella Kay. This is the point at which we start setting up the idea of Gatsby as a victim. A legal device was used against him. Notice, though, he charged the people with contempt because they were ignorant, but he actually is the one that's ignorant. It's women that know things that somehow has affected him. When we exit the Gatsby flashback, we have this really amazing scene where Tom and three others come and visit Gatsby by accident. They're thirsty. Tom and a man named Sloane and a pretty woman in a riding habit. Notice Tom gets a name, a man gets a name, and a woman gets described as pretty and what she wears. Tom later on says something that sort of aligns with the way Nick is presenting these people. I may be old-fashioned in my ideas, but women run around too much these days to suit me. indicating a certain sense of worldliness, but also men just feel as though they can have opinions about women. At this party, we have one of the most dehumanizing instances of this tendency of men to describe women. Gatsby indicated a gorgeous, scarcely human orchid of a woman. All right, this is Nick. Nick is describing this. All Gatsby did was point out the movie star. Nick is the one that chooses this language of scarcely human and orchid. Right, so you'll remember this idea of the dehumanizing, the male gaze. Here is one of the moments where it's particularly acute. It also is going to be part of this whole metaphor of flowers that happen, which we'll look at later on. Daisy, though, because women can also talk about this, Daisy told me the girl was common, but pretty, which kind of seems paradoxical, although common here might indicate more class than looking common. And later on, when they're sitting at this table, listening to people, Nick describes the girl addressed, and then a massive and lethargic woman. Men do not get described in this same way. And Nick does not move between boy and man in the same way he moves so easily between girl and woman. Other textures that have to do with this small theme. Take, for instance, geography. He, Dan Cody, turned up as James Gats's destiny in Little Girl Bay. Now you might argue, hey, this is just a point of geography. It's just called Little Girl Bay. Well, it's not an accident. You can choose where you set things. And so the novel itself, or Fitzgerald, has constructed the novel to take place where this awakening of Gats and Dan come together in a place called Little Girl. All right? So something is happening here, almost as though the land of little girls is where men find something in common and grow out of it. Who is sacrificed? Where do things take place? We can also have this texture through allusion. And in this case, we have a historical allusion. We learn an infinite number of women tried to separate him, that's Cody, from his money. The none too savory ramifications by which Ella Kay, the newspaper woman, played Madame de Maintenon to his weaknesses. Two things. One, we learn that Ella Kay is a newspaper woman. It's almost said with contempt, right? This is a person that's working, a journalist, and it gets an allusion, a historical allusion to Madame de Maintenon. This is Francois d'Aubigne, the Marquise de Maintenon. She was a 17th, 18th century aristocratic woman, the wife of the King of France, Louis XIV, and enormously influential. Right? You might consider her almost a prime minister today. Obviously, there was a lot of gossip about her as such, and the amount of influence that she had on the king. What we have here is this sense of blame that women take advantage of weaknesses. By making this historical allusion, we also finish it out and realize that if the Madame is the wife to Louis, Louis is the king, which serves to make the Dan Cody a king, an aristocrat, a authoritative figure. So why does this matter? Well, we are setting up a pattern of men blaming women without women being able to speak back, in particular with that historical allusion. What happened after all the last time we saw a woman speak up? Where does she spoke another woman's name? We had a broken nose. You'll remember that with Myrtle. Also, as an aside, what is it with this book and noses? We've got some more noses in this chapter. All of you universal conspiracy theorists, go after it. Figure it out. The next thing I want to look at is this idea of the frontier metaphor and why we have this whole flashback to Dan Cody. First of all, in his name, we have perhaps an allusion to the historical figure of Buffalo Bill Cody, one of these great narratives of the frontier. So we learned two important things here about Cody. Cody was 50 years old then, a product of the Nevada silver fields of the Yukon, of every rush for metal since 75. It's 1875. The transactions in Montana copper that made him many times a millionaire found him physically robust, but on the verge of soft-mindedness. And then later, the pioneer debauchee, who, during one phase of American life, brought back to the eastern seaboard the savage violence of the frontier brothel and saloon. All of this is part of a narrative of manifest destiny. And what this is a sense of white settlers going to the West and displacing the native peoples that are there. And they get to do it because it's the destiny from God to expand. And really what it is, though, it's an economic drive, right? They found gold and silver. Some of you might know a football team called the 49ers. Perhaps you don't know what it's named after. It's named after gold prospectors in 1849 who rushed to California to dig and search for gold. Here, we learn about Cody. He started his interest in the Nevada silver fields, then went to the Yukon. The Yukon was another site of a gold rush, and that's why we get every rush for metal since 75, right? He's a follower after money, and specifically money in its raw form. Hence, we get Montana copper. So he's traveled all over the place, taking advantage of the environmental surroundings. One thing I think you could mount that would be really interesting is a critique of Dan Cody as almost somebody that has profited from nature. That might be kind of an interesting thing to think about today, because we also have a world in which people are trying to exploit natural resources for different purposes. Then, of course, we find him physically robust, right? He's done all of this work, but he's on the verge of soft-mindedness. Part of this idea of the soft-mindedness is the way Nick describes it, that women can take advantage of him, but also it's because he has succumbed to alcoholism in a lot of ways. So we then get the second description, right? He's described as a pioneer, one of these great terms of white American exceptionalism. You went forth and you were the first person there. What a pioneer. But he's also a debauchee, a nice French word for his excess. Like these two different elements. We have American firmness and robustness next to French extravagance. And we get this idea of one phase of American life. Nick is dividing up the world, which makes sense because he's just come back from World War I. His entire narrative is disrupted. So there's almost this idea of a former glory age when you could gain wealth by working with your hands, which raises a critique of how do you gain wealth now? Well, after this figure had gone west, he returned. He brought back to the east the savage violence of the frontier brothel and saloon. So brothels, you know, are places where they're whorehouses, right? It's where you would go and pay to have sex. And a saloon is a bar. So these are things that he's brought back from the frontier. He's a certain amount of savagery. And that's no accident that's the term, because a savage is a person that doesn't have any familiarity with social niceties. Social niceties are the kind of accepted norms of class society, knowing where you fit based on how you behave. And we transition almost immediately from this point into that scene where Tom Sloan and the unnamed woman visit Gatsby. Social niceties, or, as I wanted to subtitle it, do you have a horse? You come to supper with me, said the lady enthusiastically. Both of you. This included me. Mr. Sloan got to his feet. Come along, he said, but to her only. I mean it, she insisted. I'd love to have you, lots of room. Gatsby looked at me questioningly. He wanted to go, and he didn't see that Mr. Sloan had determined he shouldn't. I'm afraid I won't be able to, I said. Will you come? She urged, concentrating on Gatsby. Mr. Sloan murmured something close to her ear. Oh, we won't be late if we start now, she insisted aloud. I haven't got a horse, said Gatsby. I used to ride in the army, but I've never bought a horse. I'll have to follow you in my car. Excuse me, just a minute. The rest of us walked out on the porch, where Sloane and the lady began an impassioned conversation aside. My God, I believe the man's coming, said Tom. Doesn't he know she doesn't want him? She says she does want him. She has a big dinner party, and he won't know a soul there. He frowned. I wonder where the devil he met Daisy. By God, I may be old-fashioned in my ideas, but women run around too much these days to suit me. They meet all kinds of crazy fish. Suddenly, Mr. Sloane and the lady walked down the steps and mounted their horses. Come on, said Mr. Sloane to Tom. We're late. We've got to go. And then to me, tell him we couldn't wait, will you? Tom and I shook hands. The rest of us exchanged a cool nod, and they trotted down the drive, disappearing under the August foliage, just as Gatsby, with his hat and light overcoat in hand, came out of the front door. There's a kind of wonderful pathos in that last moment where Gatsby doesn't actually understand these different classes and what's happening. Notice, for instance, Tom's insistence that he can't believe the man's coming, right? He doesn't belong to this kind of society. Something I didn't mention before is the woman only starts talking after she's had 2 drinks, 2 highballs. And so the novel, the narrator's kind of pointing out, hey, when you mix alcohol with society, this is what ends up happening. And notice it is the woman that made the invitation. This is another way in which there's a critique of female behavior. She doesn't even have a name, and now she's making this invitation. And something else, pay attention to this idea of I haven't got a horse, right? At the party and previously, we learned all of these things about Tom and polo and how polo is this sport played on horses. And there's this sense of what do you do with your money? Well, if you're old money, you inherited money, you have land and you have horses. Gatsby connects horses to the army, which is almost a risk to take, right? Because Tom certainly didn't go to the army. People that are forced to go to the army go to the army. Nick's family didn't, like Nick ended up going, right? But his grandfather, or his ancestor had paid somebody else to go in his place. He comes from a different kind of wealth, right? Nick straddles these 2 things, these 2 stages. He's in between them. One of the things that Tom is upset about is that Gatsby won't know a soul there. Gatsby loves throwing parties where he doesn't know anybody, but that's opposite of the way that high society has their parties. And then in that pathos, everybody just leaves. So this is a reminder, a strong reminder of old and new money and those social niceties. And we get this idea again with the party. And old money, you'll remember, is East Egg. New money is West Egg. New money comes from film and entertainment, music, bootlegging, as we're about to learn, whereas old money is inherited wealth. You might also consider Cody as a type of new money, right? He went out and he prospected on his own to gain it. Who is this Gatsby anyhow? Demanded Tom suddenly. Some big bootlegger? Where'd you hear that? I inquired. I didn't hear it. I imagined it. A lot of these newly rich people are just big bootleggers, you know. Not Gatsby, I said shortly. He was silent for a moment. The pebbles of the drive crunched under his feet. Well, he certainly must have strained himself to get this menagerie together. Notice Tom's insistence on wondering who this Gatsby is. We have the advantage of Nick having just told us all about James Gatz, but Tom doesn't know this. And also, it seems to be that Nick is manipulating the way in which he's telling us these events, because he easily could have started with that because he's writing this whole novel after all of this has taken place, right? After I came back. So we get the sense of a bootlegger, and you'll remember a bootlegger is a person that transports alcohol illegally. One of the rumors that we started the chapter with, that we didn't look at in this video, but that you read, is some secret pipeline that comes from Canada down into America. Nick tries to stand up for Gatsby a little bit, and we learned that Tom has imagined this, right? He's making it up, but it's the same rumor that we've heard from many other people. However, it's this very specific phrase that he uses, Tom, newly rich people. There's a solid critique of the newly rich, which is the new money. The French term for it is the nouveau riche, which you might have heard. There's a slight bit of odd violence as well in the pebbles crunching under his feet. And then his comment, he certainly must have strained himself, right? There's a strong sense of contempt in this idea of straining, right? That means to work for something, to strive for something. Tom has this nonchalant acceptance of wealth that he just deserves it. So he doesn't strain after anything. He just accepts things that come toward him. And then he uses the specific word, which is a menagerie. A menagerie is a fancy term for a zoo, except where zoos might have everyday animals. With a menagerie, everything is exotic. And so this is another form of dehumanization where Tom views Gatsby's parties as full of exotic animals, not the kind of people that you associate with and like, deserve to be there, right? Each one is odd. All of this fits into a kind of dominant metaphor of the self-made man. So now we're going to look at the flashback a little bit. James Gatz, that was really, or at least legally, his name. He had changed it at the age of 17 and at the specific moment that witnessed the beginning of his career, when he saw Dan Cody's yacht drop anchor over the most insidious flat on Lake Superior. It was James Gatz who had been loafing along the beach that afternoon in a torn green jersey and a pair of canvas pants, but it was already Jay Gatsby who borrowed a rowboat, pulled out to a loamy, and informed Cody that a wind might catch him and break him up in half an hour. I suppose he'd had the name ready for a long time even then. His parents were shiftless and unsuccessful farm people. His imagination had never really accepted them as his parents at all. The truth was that Jay Gatsby of West Egg, Long Island, sprang from his platonic conception of himself. He was a son of God, a phrase which, if it means anything, means just that, and he must be about his father's business, the service of a vast, vulgar, and meretricious beauty. So he invented just the sort of Jay Gatsby that a 17-year-old boy would be likely to invent, and to this conception he was faithful to the end. Hugely important point, James Gatz, and this idea of the self-made man, the self-invented man. And specifically, notice the levels of agency that we have here. We go from James Gatz, who has loafing on the beach, to taking control. He borrows a rowboat and he pulls out to the Tuolumne, right? That means that he's rowing, he's active in it. And you'll remember, I hope, from page 2, this idea of the dust that's floating in the wake of his dreams. Gatsby is striving. He's on this boat. And keep this in mind because we have all of those metaphors of drifting. So we have these kind of two different water metaphors that are happening. People that control what's going on in the water and people that are not controlling the water. And then a couple of points to make out. Right, we have this kind of idea of truth, which brings us into a realm of philosophy, at which point we have Platonic conception. Platonic conception refers to Plato, who was a Greek philosopher, and this especially refers to a deep abuse of Plato's philosophy. But essentially the idea is there's a perfect version of something that exists kind of in the heavens. So these are boots behind me, but they're imitations of the bootiness of the boot, which is in heaven. What's called the Platonic ideal. And here we have the Platonic conception. Conception is a hugely important word because it indicates a creation, right? And then we shift from this kind of Greek term to a metaphor of the Bible, Son of God. What this is going to do is it's going to set Gatsby up as a Jesus figure, but that also sets him up as a messianic figure. Sorry, that's going to be hard to read. He's a Messiah, right? He's bringing in a new age. And that's why we have his father's business. His father, of course, referring to God, father of Jesus, and business capitalized because we are in a deeply capitalistic system, right? That we have this sense almost that Jay Gatsby's business is what he needs to do, right? He needs to usher in this new age of capitalism and easy wealth and money equaling quality. And that's why we get the conception at the end, right? He has birthed this thing. And what do you do if you have a platonic conception? And what do you do if you have this like self-conception? Well, he has gotten rid of the role of the woman in conceiving. So where Jesus actually gets rid of the role of the man because it has an immaculate conception, here we get rid of it the other way. So it's another form of like low key, well, this is kind of high key misogyny. All right, let's turn back time. You'll remember from last week that we spent a lot of time thinking about chapter 5 and the defunct clock. Well, we're going to pick up some of that metaphor. He broke off and began to walk up and down a desolate path of fruit rinds and discarded favors and crushed flowers. I wouldn't ask too much of her, I ventured. You can't repeat the past. Can't repeat the past? He cried incredulously. Why? Of course you can. He looked around him wildly, as if the past were lurking here in the shadow of his house, just out of reach of his hand. I'm going to fix everything just the way it was before, he said, nodding determinedly. She'll see. He talked a lot about the past, and I gathered that he wanted to recover something, some idea of himself, perhaps, that had gone into loving Daisy. His life had been confused and disordered since then, but if he could once return to a certain starting place and go over it all slowly, he could find out what that thing was. Something that I think is elegant here is the idea of the crushed flowers. Once a flower has been broken, you can't actually return it to the stage. And so it introduces us to this idea of whether you can repeat the past or not. Hugely important. If anything, I think to remember about this is Gatsby's idea that you can repeat the past. You'll remember the defunct clock from before, all that emphasis on time. Well, Gatsby is a person that wants to restart. Ask yourselves, like, have you ever wanted to go back, repeat a conversation, repeat a different moment, have it work out again, start slowly? What Gatsby wants to do, right, is have the knowledge that he has now, go back and do everything more carefully. This is another form of taking an ideal and repeating it. Picking up off of this and those crushed flowers, here's just a nice bit of wordplay that I enjoy. Whereas this is a deep flashback, and it's difficult to tell how much of this is just fantasy on Nick's part and how much of it might be something that's told. I think personally it's all fantasy, but his heart beat faster and faster as Daisy's white face came up to his own. He knew that when he kissed this girl and forever wed his unutterable visions to her perishable breath, his mind would never romp again like the mind of God. So he waited, listening for a moment longer to the tuning fork that had been struck upon a star. Then he kissed her. At his lips' touch, she blossomed for him like a flower, and the incarnation was complete. A low-key thing, this star here, that's lowercase. Earlier on, the movie star was capitalized, and there also we had a kiss. However, what I want to point to is some low-key puns here on Daisy's name, which is obviously a flower. Then we get the idea of blossoming. The simile makes it all clear with flower, and then incarnation and the idea of the carnation as a flower and a creation. So just some skilled wordplay. There's only one follow-up question on the forum. Read this above quotation, and what do you think Nick was about to say? Through all he said, even through his appalling sentimentality, I was reminded of something, an elusive rhythm, a fragment of lost words that I had heard somewhere a long time ago. For a moment, a phrase tried to take shape in my mouth, and my lips parted like a dumb man's, as though there was more struggling upon them than a wisp of startled air. But they made no sound, and what I had almost remembered was uncommunicable forever. So again, what do you think Nick was about to say? Jump on the forum and let us know.